Hello, if you are looking for a place to relax your mind, drift into an ancient world where time moves slowly and life flows with the breath of the Nile, then you have come to the right place. Today, you and I will travel back thousands of years to the land of pyramids, giant stone statues, and plagues. You may have heard of the bubonic plague, which swept through Europe during the Middle Ages. But few know that the ancient Egyptians, with all their medical knowledge, devotion to cleanliness, and spiritual rituals, also faced terrifying diseases that silently drained life in a matter of days, even hours. Tonight, you don't have to worry. Just lie still, breathe evenly, and let me take you through the dusty alleys of an Egyptian village, deep into the earthen house of a sick commoner. We will slow down with them, wake up with them, try to survive with them, on a day when death can come at any moment. Of course, the journey will be gentle and leisurely, nothing too dramatic. Just quiet stories, everyday details, and the quiet heartbeat of a civilization that has been dormant for millennia. Now, if you are ready, close your eyes and imagine. Imagine yourself in a small village in southern Egypt, just a few minutes' walk from the Nile River. The sun has barely risen, leaving a faint orange glow behind the distant dunes. The air is salty with river mist, mixed with the scents of rotting grass, damp earth, and last night's dust. You live in a mud brick house, low roof, thick walls, keeping the heat of the day out at night. On the roof, a few stalks of wheat have dried in the sun since the day before and have not been collected. Beside you is an earthenware pot containing water brought from the well yesterday afternoon, already lukewarm. You are an ordinary farmer. Every morning you wake up to the distant cry of ibises, to the familiar footsteps of cows passing through the sandy alleys. Today, like every other day, you wear a simple linen loincloth tied with a thin rope. Your hands are dry and cracked, covered with tiny cuts from harvesting papyrus and tending the fields near the river. In the courtyard, your mother is preparing breakfast, naturally fermented bread, slightly sour and cracked and some weak beer. They drink it like water, not to get drunk, but because clean water is so scarce. Your son is trying to start a fire with flint and a bundle of damp straw, and your youngest daughter is playing with a clay doll that has one ear chipped. Life seems to go on as usual. You stop by the temple of Sobek in the morning, bowing before the stone crocodile, not out of extreme reverence, but out of habit. Worship is a rhythm, not to be understood, just repeated. It is how you keep the world in order, but something is a little strange today. Your neighbor, the old woman who always gives you dried figs, doesn't answer the door this morning. There's no smell of porridge coming from her kitchen. There's no familiar cough. As you walk out of the village toward the fields, you see a child vomiting in a bush. Not exactly unusual. Egyptian children often have stomach aches from dirty water, but what makes you stop is the purple spots on the child's wrists. The bumps are raised, as if the skin is rebelling against its own body. You frown and keep walking. Maybe it's just mosquitoes. Maybe it's a fever. But something starts to creep inside you, something insidious, like the taste of ash in the wind. As evening falls, you return home. The wind from the desert begins to pick up, carrying fine sand and a faint howl in the distance. A sound that the village elders say is the whispering of ancient spirits. You take a sip of beer, then lie down next to the haystack. Little did you know, just a few hours later, your body would start shaking, and the fever wouldn't go away. You think it's just another day, but in reality it's your last day in an intact world. Imagine you are an ancient Egyptian scholar. Your hair is shaved, your eyes are lined with black galena, and you are sitting in a dimly lit room where the light from an oil lamp bounces off rows of hieroglyphs carefully carved on a stone tablet. Your task is to record what no one wants to remember, an unknown, formless disease that has crept through fields and villages, leaving behind corpses and cries. In fact, the Egyptians did not have a specific word for plague in the sense we know it today. But in the earliest records, especially those from the Middle Kingdom, there's mention of something called out of breath, meaning the breath of death. It has no clear form. It could be a sudden heat, a shiver in the middle of the night, or a strange swelling that won't go away. Some modern scholars believe that the Egyptians faced waves of severe disease, possibly anthrax, smallpox, or, as we focus today, the first form of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yernia pestis cause. You may be wondering, how could such a disease appear in ancient Egypt, a place that seemed clean, orderly, and developed? The answer lies in geography. Egypt was a center of trade. Camel caravans carried salt, cloth, frankincense, and rats, not intentionally but accidentally. Rats lived in grain sacks, storehouses, and even the holds of ships on the Nile. Rats carried fleas. And fleas, little things, were the heralds of death. From the Red Sea, merchants from the Arabian Peninsula, Nubia, and even as far away as Mesopotamia brought with them goods and, inadvertently, uncontrollable pathogens. Medical texts, such as the famous Ebers Papyrus, a medical text more than 3,500 years old, describe symptoms that we might expect today to be signs of the plague: painful swelling in the groin, high fever, delirium, and death within days. But rather than seeing it as a biological phenomenon, the ancients attributed it to the divine, to the anger of the gods. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess said to embody anger and disease, was often invoked to take the breath of death from the throats of the people. Priests dressed in white, holding lion-headed staffs, went from house to house, sprinkling scented water and burning myrrh incense to ward off evil. But no scent was strong enough to stop the disease. One of the earliest outbreaks of disease that the Egyptians may have witnessed occurred during the transition from the 13th dynasty to the Second Intermediate Period, a time when the government was weak. The country was divided and famine was rampant. It was in chaos that disease often found its way to the surface. When cities were left without rulers, when rituals were disrupted, and when thousands of people were forced to leave their homes in search of food, it was when death could slip through the cracks in the open door. Modern archaeologists have excavated mass cemeteries on the outskirts of Abydos, where hundreds of skeletons lay haphazardly with no sign of proper burial. Bones were piled on top of each other. Some of the bodies bore evidence of injuries not caused by weapons, but by the swelling and convulsions of their bodies. Although there is no direct DNA evidence to identify the plague bacterium in ancient Egypt, the context, high population density, frequent presence of rats and fleas, and description of symptoms lends support to the Egyptian plague hypothesis. But whether it was the plague, smallpox, or anthrax, to the ancient people, they were all the test of the gods. What is scary is not the fever, not the pain, but the feeling that you have been turned away from the gods, that your soul is no longer balanced on the scales of Ma'at, the symbol of cosmic order. A sick person is not just facing physical death, but spiritual death, died without embalming, died without a prayer, died forgotten, hastily buried on the riverbank, where the ground is slippery and the soul cannot rest. Now imagine you are a modern-day archaeologist, standing in the silent wind of the desert. Before you are the ruins of a small settlement, perhaps occupied by workers building the temples of Dir, El Medina, or a civilian cemetery hidden behind the tombs of Thebes. You take a soft brush in your hand, and with each stroke you brush away layers of dust that have accumulated over millennia. Beneath the dirt, a fragment of pottery is revealed, just a portion of a grain jar, but it's clearly marked with burn marks. No one knows why, but in ancient Egyptian history, when people started burning everyday objects, it often meant they were desperate. to stop the spread of something invisible. There is no stele that says, "Here is where the plague happened." But by piecing together archaeological fragments, researchers are gradually imagining the shadow of a silent death that once swept through this country. In many low-class burial grounds, especially in the less noticed village cemeteries, the number of graves increased dramatically during the same period. Bones were scattered in small groups, not in rows. Many skeletons were not embalmed, had no protective amulets, and were even buried with household trash, a rarity in a civilization as death-obsessed as Egypt. Some graves were filled with crushed stone instead of clay, as if the living wanted to prevent the dead from returning. In major temples such as Karnak and Edfu, archaeologists have found repainted walls or overturned statues. These may not be directly related to disease, but in many cases, the Egyptians believed that a sacred space needed to be closed when it was desecrated by an unnatural death. One of the strangest clues comes from wooden tablets discovered in Saqqara, where the names of the dead were recorded. Over a short period of time, the list of names swelled dramatically, and many of the names were the same family name. This could point to a mass death, perhaps due to war or disease. Besides physical archaeology, another aspect exploited by modern scholars is in art. Some murals feature rare scenes, such as people kneeling before Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, not in a festive setting but in a bleak landscape. Art, it seems, has also become a place for deep anxieties. On the papyrus fragments, people found exorcisms noted in hieroglyphics with contents such as, "If there is a strange heat in the house, take holy water, mix it with sycamore resin, and place it under the patient's pillow for 3 days. If the tongue is swollen, the eyes are red, the breath is bad. Leave the person alone, no one touches, no one talks to." Though they did not use the word quarantine, the Egyptians clearly understood contagion, instinctive, observational. They did not know about germs, but they knew that death could spread from person to person. And they responded with ritual, with exorcisms, with prayers, with scented water and incense. Some special amulets were even made to protect against plagues. One of the most precious specimens was a carnelian amulet shaped like a magic eye engraved with the Ankh symbol and the feather of Ma'at placed on the chest of the deceased as a way to protect the soul from being drawn to evil. Yet what is remarkable is that, despite facing great loss, the Egyptians did not let the plague overwhelm their memory. They left behind a monument to life, to the gods, to the rising sun. They do not talk much about death, but let it sink into the dust, as light as a vapor drifting across the Nile. And so, centuries later, we must listen closely, to hear the echoes of a fear that has been buried for so long. Imagine you are standing in a luxurious mansion in ancient Thebes, the religious and cultural capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom. The ceiling was painted in rich colors, depicting lotus petals floating on a soft blue background. The polished limestone floor reflected the shimmering light from the scented oil lamps. A small statue of Thoth sat in the corner, looking down with a solemn expression. You are not a farmer, a stonemason, or a boatman. You are an elite, a royal secretary perhaps, or a priest at the temple of Amun. Your life is wrapped in the finest linen, nourished by honey, roasted duck, and carefully selected dates. But even here, where there is a wall separating us from the civilian world, the breath of death can still creep in. One of your servants starts coughing, then the storekeeper, then a member of the household. And within 3 days, the entire mansion is silent save for gasps, groans, and mumbled prayers. Ancient Egyptians, regardless of rank, believed that in order for the soul to continue its journey into the afterlife, the body had to be preserved intact through an elaborate mummification process that lasted dozens of days. But during times of plague, this process was sometimes shortened or skipped. Even nobles could be buried hastily in uncarved coffins with fewer charms than prescribed. Embalmers, fearful of infection, often wore long-sleeved shirts and covered their faces, a simple but remarkable form of protection. They also began burning incense more heavily, not only to ward off the smell of death, but also as a spiritual act of reassurance. In the inscriptions inside the tombs of the elite, sometimes there appear very faint notes, hidden in the funeral orations. "We can't delay any longer. The spirit is one step ahead of me." The person was buried with an apology for not having completed the ceremony. Even the pharaohs who were considered living gods were not completely immune. While there is no clear evidence that a specific pharaoh died from the disease, short reigns, power vacuums, and sudden changes in government have all raised questions for historians. During the 18th dynasty, for example, kings like Amenhotep III ordered hundreds of statues of Sekhmet, the goddess of retribution, to be placed around the Karnak temple. Some scholars believe this reflected a collective fear, perhaps of plague. Why worship Sekhmet? Because she can heal, but also bring disaster. Holding the power of life and death, Sekhmet symbolizes the wrath of the gods, and only through offerings, prayers, and strict social order can the people hope to appease that rage. During the long nights, high priests would light fires, offer incense, and recite prayers through the third watch, not just for the dying, but for themselves. The sacred is not an impenetrable shield, it is the fragile hope that holds you close to life. Remarkably, despite the overwhelming fear, Egyptian society did not collapse completely. The various social classes, from farmers to priests, from soldiers to craftsmen, continued their lives within established patterns. They relied on the familiar, the rhythm of the Nile, the regularity of harvests, and the religious cycle of birth and death. When faced with something they could not understand or stop, they did not despair. They worshipped. They prayed. They embalmed, painted, buried ashes in urns with the names of the dead, and carried on. Death knows no class. But how one prepares for death, that reflects everything? And so, rich or poor, the ancient Egyptians lived in a world where the line between life and death was as thin as the dust on a stone. Every morning they lit another lamp, hoping that today would still be a day of life. Now you have accompanied me through a day in an ancient world where death could come as gently as a hot wind from the desert, and life was measured in sips of clean water and rays of sunlight that were not too harsh. We begin on a simple morning in a dusty village near the banks of the Nile, where a farmer begins his day not knowing that it will be the last day he will feel the familiar rhythm of life. Then we look back into the nameless pages of history, the smudges in ancient medical texts, in the way the Egyptians viewed disease as divine wrath, not simply a biological event. We have passed through archaeological strata, where death is not carved on tombstones, but is imprinted in the hasty way people are buried, in the stirred-up ashes, in the spells written in a trembling hand. And then, finally, we saw the fragility of an entire civilization, not because they were weak, but because they, like us, had no sure answer to their greatest fear, loss. But in that fragility there is a strange beauty. The ancient Egyptians did not run away from death. They lived with it, creating rituals, painting, mummifying, lighting lamps, praying, not to avoid it, but to understand that death is not the end, but just another door in the endless cycle of the universe. Whether a baker or a great pharaoh, whether one lives in a mud brick house or in a marble temple, all breathe the same air, and all wait for the day when Anubis calls their name. And you, as you lay your head on the pillow tonight, are also lying in that ancient rhythm. But unlike them, you have a soft light by your bed, a steady fan, warm blankets, and sleep that is not interrupted by screams or raging fevers. You live in an age where death no longer comes quietly in the middle of the night like it used to. So let the remaining thoughts dissolve like desert dust. Let your breathing slow down. blending with the thousand-year-old rhythm of the Nile. You are safe. You are warm. You don't need to survive in that world. You just dream about it. Have a peaceful night.